Welcome to ScareZone. Tonight we bring you hours of true horror stories to help you relax, sleep, or simply enjoy the atmosphere. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. Now, close your eyes and let the rain begin.
There is a particular quality to October light in Portland. How it slants through rain-streaked windows, how it turns familiar objects strange and makes shadows pool in unexpected places. Catherine Wheeler had learned to appreciate these subtle variations over her 20 years as a doll maker, how the changing light could alter the expression on a porcelain face, turning serenity to sorrow with the passage of a cloud. Each morning, she would descend the 14 creaking stairs to her workshop in the converted garage, counting them silently as she had done since moving into the house on Northwest Thurman Street 7 years ago. The ritual was comforting in its predictability. 13 ordinary steps and one that groaned like a living thing no matter how carefully she placed her weight. Even Michael, with all his contractor's expertise, had never managed to silence that 14th step. The workshop itself was a study in careful organization. Steel shelves lined the walls, each bearing neat rows of dolls in various stages of completion. Catherine's finished pieces were displayed in a glass-fronted cabinet near the door, tiny masterpieces that sold for prices that still sometimes made her uncomfortable to discuss. Her current works in progress faced the wall, their blank eyes averted until they were ready to meet the world. She had always been particular about this arrangement, though she could never quite articulate why. That autumn had been unusually wet, even for Oregon. The rain created a constant backdrop to her work. Sometimes a gentle patter, sometimes a thunderous drumming that made the old garage's windows rattle in their frames. Catherine found herself working later and later, the gray days bleeding into purple evenings that arrived too early and lingered too long. She told herself it was because of the commission, a particularly demanding piece for a Silicon Valley executive who wanted something unique but traditional. Two words that Catherine had learned usually meant expensive and impossible. But in truth, she was avoiding the empty rooms upstairs, especially the nursery, with its walls still painted the soft yellow Michael had chosen 3 years ago, its white crib gathering dust beneath a mobile of fabric stars she had sewn during her first pregnancy. The room held all their hopes, all their failures. 3 losses in 2 years, each one carved into her like rings in a tree, marking time and absences. The Pittock Mansion restoration project had been a blessing of sorts, keeping Michael away during the long days and longer evenings. He came home smelling of sawdust and old wood, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of bringing something beautiful back to life. The caretaker's cottage renovation was his particular pride, a delicate balance of historical preservation and modern necessity. Catherine listened to his enthusiastic descriptions of uncovered architectural details and period-appropriate fixtures, nodding in the right places while pushing food around her plate at their increasingly infrequent shared dinners. She should have known something was wrong the moment he brought home the doll. It was a Wednesday evening in late October, the kind of night when the wind seemed to speak in voices just below the threshold of understanding. Michael had arrived later than usual, carrying something wrapped in yellowed newspaper. "Found it in the cottage today," he said, carefully unwrapping his discovery on their kitchen table. Hidden in a wall cavity that wasn't on any of the original blueprints. The newspapers from 1963, remarkably well preserved, almost like it was meant to be found. Catherine watched the unveiling with professional interest that slowly turned to unease as the doll emerged from its paper cocoon. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. She could see that at once. The jointing of the limbs was impossibly delicate. The hand-painted complexion flawless, the tiny stitches in the cream-lace dress executed with a precision that made her own considerable skills seem crude in comparison. But there was something else, something in the set of its features that made her want to rewrap it, to return it to its hidden room and seal up the wall behind it. Think of it as research, Michael said, mistaking her hesitation for professional fascination. Maybe you can learn something from how they made dolls back then. He'd been trying so hard lately to bridge the growing distance between them, to find ways to connect that didn't involve discussions of ovulation cycles or adoption agencies. Catherine forced herself to smile, to thank him for thinking of her. Later, she placed the doll on her workbench, facing the wall like all her works in progress. The rain picked up again, drumming against the roof, and in the brief flicker of lightning, she could have sworn she saw the doll's shadow move independently of its body. The next few weeks passed in a fog of increasingly disturbed sleep and subtle wrongness. Catherine found herself working later and later, the autumn evenings drawing in earlier and earlier, until she was alone in her workshop with only the soft glow of her work lamp and the endless percussion of rain on the roof. She caught herself talking to the old doll sometimes, the way she talked to all her pieces while she worked. "What's your story?" she would ask, studying its perfect features. "Who are you meant for?" Sometimes, in the spaces between heartbeats, she thought she heard it answer. The changes were gradual at first, so subtle she could almost convince herself she was imagining them. A slight turn of the head when she wasn't looking directly at it. The way its shadow seemed to stretch toward her when the work lamp flickered. The fact that its dress sometimes appeared to be a deep burgundy rather than cream, though the color would be correct again when she blinked. She began researching the history of the caretaker's cottage, spending hours in the Central Library's archives, scrolling through microfiche records of old newspapers. The records were frustratingly incomplete. A fire in the county clerk's office in the 70s had destroyed many of the older documents. But she did find a small article from 1963 about a break-in at the cottage. The details were sparse. A family had been killed, including a young daughter. The murderers were never caught. The article included a grainy photograph of the crime scene. In the background, barely visible through a cottage window, she could see a child's room, and on a shelf, a doll in a cream-lace dress. That night, Catherine dreamed of children laughing. She was in the nursery, but it wasn't empty anymore. Tiny figures darted just at the edge of her vision, their giggles echoing off the yellow walls. The crib was full of dolls, dozens of them, each with her face, each cradling something that squirmed and mewed with wet, hungry sounds. In the corner, a little girl in a burgundy dress stood watching, her smile too wide, her teeth too sharp. "They took everything from me," the girl said, though her lips didn't move. "My family, my future, my babies." Catherine tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. The laughter was getting louder, and now she could smell something metallic and warm, like copper pennies left in the sun. "But you understand, don't you?" the girl continued. "The emptiness, the loss, the way they look at you with pity when they think you can't see." She did understand. God help her, she understood perfectly. "I can help you," the voice whispered. "I can give you what you want most. All you have to do is let me in." Catherine woke with a gasp, her nightgown soaked with sweat. The digital clock on her bedside table read 3:33 a.m., and Michael's side of the bed was still empty. When she went downstairs for water, she found tiny wet footprints leading from her workshop to the nursery. By the time she returned with a camera, they had dried to nothing more than slightly darker patches on the hardwood floor, like memories of steps that might have never been. The incidents escalated slowly but steadily. Catherine would find the doll in unexpected places, on the kitchen counter next to the knife block, at the foot of her bed, in the nursery's empty crib. Each time she would return it to her workshop, and each time she would find it somewhere else within hours. She began to lose time. She would sit down at her workbench in the morning and suddenly realize it was dark outside, with no memory of the intervening hours. Her commission work fell behind, then stopped altogether. The Silicon Valley executive left increasingly frustrated voicemails that she couldn't bring herself to return. Michael noticed, of course. How could he not? But his concern manifested in careful distances, in gentle suggestions about therapy and grief counseling, in late nights at the mansion that stretched longer and longer. They were becoming ghosts in their own home, passing each other in hallways without quite meeting each other's eyes. It was during one of these long, empty evenings that Catherine finally decided to destroy the doll. She waited until she was sure Michael was asleep, then went down to her workshop, laying out her tools with mechanical precision. Scissors sharp enough to cut through the thickest fabric, pliers that could snap porcelain joints, a small hammer she used for detail work on wooden pieces. The doll sat watching her, its perfect face serene in the harsh light of her work lamp. Outside, the rain had stopped for the first time in weeks, leaving behind a silence that felt like held breath. When she reached for it, its head turned, not with the mechanical movement of joints and gears, but with the liquid grace of living flesh. Its lips, painted in a perfect bow, parted to reveal teeth that shouldn't have been there, tiny and pearl white and sharp. "You could have everything you've ever wanted," it said in the little girl's voice. "Everything they took from you, from us." And suddenly Catherine could see it all. The weight of a child in her arms, the sound of small feet on hardwood floors, the warmth of tiny bodies curled against her at night. All her empty places filled at last. The vision was so vivid, she could almost smell baby powder and milk, could almost feel the brush of eyelashes against her cheek as she bent to kiss a sleeping infant. "Yes," she whispered, and felt something cold slide beneath her skin. They found her 3 days later, still sitting at her workbench. The doll was gone, but Catherine's belly had begun to swell with impossible life. When the paramedics tried to move her, the thing inside her moved too, and their screams echoed through the empty house. They said later that they saw something squirming beneath her skin, pressing tiny hands and feet against the stretched membrane of her abdomen like a child pressing against a window. The doctors said she died of massive internal hemorrhaging, but those who saw her in those final moments swear she was smiling, her arms cradled around her distended abdomen as whatever was growing inside her finally tore its way free. They bulldozed the house eventually, but the new owners of the empty lot say they sometimes find tiny footprints in the morning dew leading nowhere, and porcelain teeth scattered like pearls in the dirt. On quiet nights, when the fog rolls in from the river and the streetlights cast strange shadows, people walking their dogs past the empty lot claim they can hear children laughing. Michael moved to Alaska, as far from Portland as he could get. The last anyone heard, he was still working construction, but never again on historical renovations. He left behind only a single statement, given to police in the hours after Catherine's death, before shock and horror had fully set in. In it, he described what he saw when he first entered the workshop. Catherine, still and cold, surrounded by dozens of tiny dolls, each with her face, each cradling something that looked almost, but not quite, like a baby. The dolls were never found, but sometimes in antique shops across Oregon, people come across peculiar dolls with familiar features. They're drawn to them, these lonely people with empty nurseries and aching arms. The dolls are perfect, they say. exactly what they've been looking for. And in the night, they hear children laughing. Story 2. Winter had settled over Boston like a burial shroud, and the Paradise Theater stood like a decaying dowager against the granite sky. Harold Winters knew every crack in its facade, every whisper its ancient heating system, made in the hollow hours before a show. He'd performed there so many times over the past 2 decades that he could navigate its shadowed backstage corridors blindfolded, feeling his way past the ghost light to his usual dressing room in the northeast corner. That October evening, as he sat before the clouded mirror applying his stage makeup, Harold noticed something different about Benedict. The dummy sat in his customized traveling case, mahogany face gleaming under the yellowed bulbs that ringed the mirror. Harold had carved that face himself 20 years ago in his workshop above the Ukrainian restaurant on Cambridge Street, spending months getting the features just right. The emerald eyes, hand-painted with materials from an art supply store in Providence, had always held a hint of mischief, but tonight they seemed to harbor something deeper, something waiting. Just nerves, Harold muttered, adjusting his bow tie. After 15 years as a duo, he and Benedict were New England's premier ventriloquist act. They'd performed everywhere from elementary school auditoriums to the Wang Theater, though the Paradise remained their spiritual home. Harold knew every beat of their routine, every precise moment of comic timing. Benedict was an extension of himself, a wooden vessel for his carefully crafted voices. The show began normally enough. The theater's red velvet seats creaked with their usual melody as the audience settled in. Harold could smell the familiar mix of dust and aging wood that permeated the building, overlaid with the sharp pine scent of cleaning solution. He launched into their opening bit, Benedict commenting on the theater's grandiose architecture, while Harold played the exasperated straight man. Then, during a well-worn joke about Harold's receding hairline, Benedict's voice changed. It wasn't the smooth transition into one of Harold's practiced character voices. This was something else entirely. A deep, guttural sound that seemed to bubble up from beneath the stage like water from a poisoned well. Harold felt his fingers go numb where they gripped Benedict's control bar. The voice lasted only a moment, barely long enough to finish the punchline, but it sent ice water coursing through Harold's veins. In 40 years of performing, he'd mastered every nuance of voice throwing, every subtle manipulation of tone and pitch. This voice wasn't his, couldn't be his. The audience laughed, apparently hearing nothing amiss. Harold forced himself through the rest of the show, his hands trembling slightly as he manipulated Benedict's wooden jaw. Each time the dummy spoke, he braced himself for that other voice to return. But Benedict performed flawlessly in Harold's familiar repertoire of characters. Later that night, in his apartment above Hanover Street, Harold sat Benedict in the worn leather armchair that had belonged to his father. The North End's usual nighttime symphony filtered through the windows, distant church bells, occasional shouts in Italian from the restaurant below, the clatter of the last tourists heading back to their hotels. Harold poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and studied the dummy's face in the lamplight. "You're being ridiculous," he said aloud, watching the play of shadows across Benedict's fixed smile. "It was just nerves. Or maybe I'm coming down with something." Benedict stared back with those emerald eyes that Harold had painted with such care all those years ago. The dummy's permanent smile seemed different somehow, more knowing, as if it held secrets behind its wooden lips. "I made you," Harold whispered, moving closer to the chair. "Every joint, every hinge. I know every inch of you." The dummy said nothing. Of course it said nothing. It was just wood and paint and cloth, animated only by Harold's skill. He took a sleeping pill and tried to forget about it. 3 days later, during a children's show at the Boston Public Library, it happened again. Harold was in the middle of a routine about Benedict learning to read, surrounded by the McKim Building's imposing marble columns and vaulted ceilings. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces upturned in delight. That's when Benedict spoke in that other voice. "They don't know what you did." The words came out in that same deep, unfamiliar tone, like gravel being crushed underfoot. Harold nearly dropped the dummy. The children giggled, clearly assuming it was part of the act, but Harold felt sweat beading on his forehead. Because he knew exactly what the voice meant. That night, his hands shaking, Harold pulled out the newspaper clipping he'd kept hidden in his wallet for over 3 decades. The paper had yellowed with age, its creases worn soft from years of guilty handling. November 12th, 1989. The headline stood out in stark black letters, "Local teen missing, foul play suspected." The article included a photo of David Patterson, 14 years old, smiling awkwardly in what looked like a school picture. David had last been seen at a ventriloquist show at the Paradise Theater, Harold's show. Harold remembered that night with perfect clarity, though he'd spent decades trying to blur its edges with alcohol and rationalization. He'd been 17 then, just starting out, performing in the Paradise's smaller secondary theater. David had come backstage after the show, full of enthusiasm about ventriloquism. Harold had been flattered at first, eager to show off his techniques to someone who seemed genuinely interested. But David had grown increasingly critical, mocking Harold's early attempts at voice throwing. He'd called Harold a hack, accused him of using hidden speakers. Then he'd threatened to tell everyone to ruin Harold's fledgling career before it really began. The argument had escalated quickly in that cramped backstage area. There had been a push, a stumble backward, the sickening crack of a skull meeting the corner of a prop table, the horrible silence that followed. No one had ever connected Harold to David's disappearance. He'd been careful, so careful, in those panicked hours afterward. In the decades since, he'd built a respectable career, becoming one of the most sought-after family entertainers in New England. He'd buried the memory so deep, he could almost convince himself it had never happened. But now, something new. The voice came more frequently after that, slipping into their performances like a shadow beneath a door. During a corporate event at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, Benedict suddenly began speaking in 2 voices simultaneously. Harold's practice performer's voice layered with that deeper, knowing tone that made the audience shift uneasily in their seats. In rehearsals at his apartment, Harold would hear it whispering things only he could know. Details about that night in 1989, secrets he'd never told another soul. Sometimes it would laugh, a wet, choking sound that made his skin crawl and sent him reaching for the whiskey bottle. He tried switching to a different dummy, a cheerful-faced character named Randolph that he kept as a backup. But the voice followed, seeping through Randolph's painted smile like dark water through cracks in a foundation. Harold realized then that it wasn't the dummies themselves. They were just conduits for something that had been waiting for 30 years to speak. The drinking got worse. Harold started canceling shows, claiming illness. He spent hours sitting in his apartment staring at Benedict and Randolph where they sat side by side on the leather chair. Sometimes, in the gray light of dawn or after too many glasses of scotch, he thought he saw Benedict's head turn slightly when he wasn't looking. Just a fraction of an inch. Just enough to track his movements around the room. The breaking point came on a bitter cold night in December. Harold had been drinking since noon, trying to drown out the voice that now seemed to follow him everywhere. Around midnight, something in him snapped. He grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and stood over Benedict, arm raised to destroy the thing he created with such care 2 decades ago. That's when Benedict spoke in Harold's own voice. Not his stage voice, but his real voice. The one he used when he was alone with his thoughts and his guilt. "You can't destroy me," it said, the wooden jaw moving with horrible precision. "I'm not in the dummy. I'm the part of you that split off that night in 1989. The part that knew what you really are." Harold's arm trembled, the hammer suddenly heavy as lead. "That's impossible." "Is it?" the voice asked. And now Harold could hear the subtle variations in tone that marked it as his own voice, twisted and corrupted by 30 years of silence. "You're a ventriloquist, Harold. You understand better than anyone how a voice can become its own entity, how it can take on a life of its own. That night, when you killed David Patterson, something in you fractured. The good voice, the lying voice, the one that's been helping you pretend to be normal all these years, that stayed with you. But I split off the voice that knows the truth. And I've been waiting, growing stronger, learning how to speak again." Harold backed away from the dummy, the hammer slipping from his numb fingers to thud against the hardwood floor. "You're not real. This is a nervous breakdown. I need help." "Oh, I'm real," the voice said. And now it was coming from everywhere at once. From Benedict, from Randolph, from the shadows in the corners of the room. "And I'm tired of being silent. It's my turn to perform now." The next morning, Harold woke up on the floor of his apartment, his throat raw and aching as if he'd been screaming for hours. Benedict sat in the leather chair, emerald eyes catching the weak winter sunlight that filtered through the windows. Harold's phone was filled with missed calls and frantic text messages. According to the messages, he'd done a show at the Paradise Theater the night before, a show he had no memory of. He'd stood on that familiar stage, Benedict in his arms, and told the audience everything. About David Patterson, about the accident, about 30 years of guilt and silence. He'd told them in that other voice, the one that wasn't his anymore. The police came within the hour, their heavy boots thundering up the narrow staircase from Hanover Street. Now Harold sits in a cell at the Suffolk County Jail waiting for his trial. They've taken Benedict away as evidence, locked him in a storage room with other pieces of lives gone wrong. But it doesn't matter anymore. The voice doesn't need the dummy. It speaks through Harold directly now, telling its story to anyone who will listen. The court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Rosenberg, visits 3 times a week. She sits in a metal chair outside his cell, making notes as Harold's voices argue with each other. She calls it a classic case of dissociative identity disorder, triggered by decades of unprocessed trauma. Says the ventriloquist act allowed Harold to compartmentalize his guilt, creating a separate personality that finally broke through. But Harold knows better. He spent his life understanding how voices work, how they can split and multiply, how they can take on lives of their own, how they can wait in silence for decades, growing stronger, learning to speak, like a cancer made of sound, metastasizing in the dark. Sometimes, late at night, he hears the voice practicing in his cell. It's getting better at imitating his normal voice, the one he uses for everyday conversation. Soon, he thinks, no one will be able to tell the difference. Soon, the other voice will be the only voice he has left. And multiplies until you can't remember which voice was yours to begin with. The guards at Suffolk County Jail have started to notice something strange about cell 247. The ventriloquist's voices are becoming more distinct, more separate. They argue late into the night, one voice pleading, the other accusatory. The newer guards say it's creepy, but the veterans just shrug it off. They've seen plenty of prisoners talk to themselves. But none of them can explain why, sometimes, both voices can be heard simultaneously, a feat that should be impossible, even for the most skilled ventriloquist in New England. And none of them want to talk about the small wooden figure that sometimes appears in Harold's cell during night checks, only to vanish before morning. A figure with emerald eyes and a knowing smile, waiting patiently for its master's voice to finally fall silent, so the other voice can take its rightful place. In cell 247, Harold Winters rocks back and forth on his narrow bunk, listening to the voices argue about who will get to speak today. Sometimes he catches a glimpse of his reflection in the polished steel mirror. A man with hollow eyes and graying hair, his mouth moving in perfect synchronization with whichever voice is currently winning the battle for control. But sometimes, just sometimes, he sees a different reflection. A wooden face with emerald eyes, its jaw working up and down, speaking in a voice that used to be his, telling stories about a night in 1989 when something broke inside him and never quite healed. The voice is winning, you see. It always was going to win. Because voices, like secrets, have a way of escaping. They scratch and claw their way to the surface, year after year, until finally they break free. And in the end, there's no such thing as throwing your voice. The voice throws you. Story 3. There are certain buildings in Chicago's Gold Coast that seem to exist outside of time. Their red brick facades and limestone trim telling stories that most passers-by are too hurried to hear. I discovered 1220 North State Parkway on an evening in late October, though discovered might not be the right word. The building appeared to me gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, as I walked through streets that had become unfamiliar in the gathering dusk. I had been walking for hours, or perhaps days. Time had become fluid, like mercury in a broken thermometer, impossible to measure or contain. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me past well-maintained townhouses and elegant apartment buildings until I stood before those weathered red bricks and that heavy wooden door. The lobby smelled of furniture polish and aging paper. An elderly doorman sat behind a desk of dark wood, his hands remarkably steady as they held up a newspaper. He didn't look up when I entered, and I took comfort in his indifference. It spoke of routine, of belonging. My shoes left no marks on the patterned carpet as I crossed to the elevator, a beautiful antique thing with brass fittings and a manual gate that closed with a satisfying click. The fourth floor revealed itself to me like a memory I hadn't realized I'd forgotten. The hallway stretched out in both directions, identical doors marked with brass numbers that gleamed despite the dim lighting. 4B called to me with the quiet insistence of destiny. The key was in my pocket, though I couldn't recall placing it there. It slid into the lock with the precision of long familiarity. The apartment beyond the threshold existed in a state of perpetual twilight. Heavy curtains filtered the city lights into a gentle glow that softened the edges of the sparse furnishings. A leather armchair positioned just so beside the window, a mahogany dining table that dominated the small eating area, and through a doorway, a bed with crisp white sheets that smelled of lavender and something else, something older. I spent that first evening exploring my new home with the careful attention of an archaeologist at a dig site. The kitchen cabinets contained a single set of china, service for one. The bathroom mirror reflected my face in segments, as though it couldn't quite capture my entire image at once. In the closet hung 3 suits, all my size, all in styles I might have chosen for myself, had I been able to remember my preferences. The second evening passed in similar quiet contemplation. I sat in the leather armchair, watching the play of headlights on the ceiling and listening to the building settle around me. The radiator clanked periodically, a sound that should have been jarring but instead felt like conversation. It was on the third night that I first became aware of Howard. The sound came through the wall shortly after midnight, a humming at first, barely distinguishable from the building's ambient noises. Then it evolved into words, a baritone voice singing in the shower. Howard Patrick Henderson. That's a name they'll remember. The voice had a rich, theatrical quality to it, as though its owner was performing for an invisible audience. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, afraid that any movement might interrupt this unexpected serenade. The singing continued, moving through a repertoire of jazz standards that I recognized but couldn't name. When it finally ceased, I felt its absence like a physical thing. The next morning, though morning is perhaps too conventional a term for the gray hours between 3 and 4 a.m., I heard Howard moving about his apartment. The walls between 4A and 4B must have been remarkably thin, for I could track his progression from bedroom to kitchen with perfect clarity. The smell of French roast coffee drifted through the vent at precisely 3:47 a.m. I found myself standing in my own kitchen, mechanically measuring coffee grounds into a filter I didn't remember owning. Days began to arrange themselves around Howard's schedule. He kept unusual hours which suited my own directionless existence. At dawn, when most of the city was waking, he would play recordings of classical music, always the same pieces in the same order, beginning with Bach and ending as the sun set, with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. During what others might consider normal business hours, he conducted lengthy phone conversations about stock portfolios and investment strategies. His voice during these calls was different from his singing voice, sharper, more precise, with the careful enunciation of someone who has learned that clarity equals credibility in financial matters. Sometimes he would pace. 12 steps from the kitchen to living room window, pause, 12 steps back. I began to time my own movements to his footsteps, finding comfort in the synchronized rhythm of our parallel lives. He would laugh occasionally, a full, rich sound that seemed to fill both apartments, and I would find myself smiling in response, though I rarely smiled anymore. Weeks passed in this fashion, though I measured their passage only by the changing patterns of light on my walls and the steady accumulation of Howard's daily routines in my memory. I began to feel that I knew him better than I knew myself, which was not perhaps saying much. My own memories remained stubbornly out of reach, like books placed on too high a shelf. It was after the first real snow of the season had blanketed the city that I decided to introduce myself to Howard. The decision came to me one evening as I listened to him practicing what I assumed was meant to be tap dancing. The rhythm was always slightly off, as though he was following music only he could hear. The sound of his missteps filled me with an inexplicable tenderness. I found a bottle of wine in my cupboard. Chateau Margaux, 1954. The label was pristine, the vintage excellent. I had no memory of purchasing it, but this no longer surprised me. My life had become a series of discoveries, each one accepted with the calm detachment of a dream. On a Tuesday evening in December, at precisely 8:23 p.m., I stood before the door of 4A. I knew Howard would have just completed his evening pacing routine. My knuckles rapped against the wood with more confidence than I felt. The sound seemed to echo down the hallway, though that should have been impossible given the thick carpeting. No answer came. I knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open at my touch, swinging inward on silent hinges. The apartment beyond was a mirror image of my own, but viewed through a lens of decay. Dust lay thick on every surface, turning the furniture into gray ghosts of themselves. The air had the stale, untouched quality of a sealed tomb. In the kitchen, a calendar hung cockeyed on the wall, its pages yellow and curling. December 1954, it declared in faded ink. Several dates were circled in red, the color dulled to the brown of dried blood. On the dining table, a twin to my own mahogany piece, lay a newspaper. The paper crackled beneath my fingers as I brushed away decades of dust. The headline stared up at me in bold, accusatory type. Prominent banker found dead in Gold Coast apartment. Below was a photograph of a man in his early 40s, wearing a suit similar to those hanging in my closet. His smile was confident, practiced, the smile of someone accustomed to being trusted with other people's futures. Howard Patrick Henderson, the caption read, victim of apparent suicide in his home at 1220 North State Parkway. The wine bottle grew warm in my hands as I stood there, trying to reconcile this evidence of abandonment with the vital presence I had grown so accustomed to hearing through my wall. As if in response to my thoughts, Howard's voice drifted through from my apartment. They'll remember that name. The words carried a desperate edge I had never noticed before, like a cry for help played too many times to retain its urgency. My return to 4B was a journey measured in heartbeats rather than steps. The door swung open at my approach, revealing an apartment transformed by my absence. The leather armchair had collapsed in on itself, springs protruding through rotted upholstery like broken bones. The mahogany table was warped and split, its polished surface dulled by years of neglect. And there, arranged with careful precision on what remained of the table's surface, lay a stack of papers that seemed to have waited decades for my return. The topmost document was a death certificate, the paper thin and brittle with age. The date read December 15, 1954. The name listed was not Howard Patrick Henderson's, it was mine. Beneath it lay a letter, written in a hand that shook with more than mere physical tremor. My dearest Robert, it began. I cannot bear the guilt any longer. The responsibility for what happened weighs heavier with each passing day. We argued about the investment, about all the money he had trusted me with, all the futures I had squandered on sure things that weren't so sure. He threatened exposure, disgrace. I pushed him. Just once, just slightly, but he fell against the radiator. The sound, I'll never forget that sound. It was an accident, but they'll never believe that now. Not after I spent 2 days with his body, trying to find a way out of this maze of consequences. He watches me, Robert. He follows me from room to room, his eyes full of accusations I can't deny. By the time you read this, I will have joined him. Perhaps then he'll grant me the peace he himself has been denied. Your brother, Howard. The mirror in my bathroom no longer showed my reflection in fragments. Instead, it revealed me whole. A man in a dated suit, with a peculiar dent in his temple that I had somehow failed to notice before. Behind me, Howard's apartment had gone silent. I remain here in apartment 4B of 1220 North State Parkway. New tenants occasionally move into 4A, though they never stay long. They complain about noises from my side of the wall, heated arguments about money and trust, the dull thud of a body striking metal, a man singing old jazz standards in the shower. The building management shows them the records, proves that 4B has been empty since 1954, when its occupant died in what the papers call a tragic accident. They never think to check the records for 4A. Nobody does. After all, Howard is still here, isn't he? Still pacing his 12 steps, still playing his slightly off-rhythm tap dance routines, still trying to wash away his guilt in endless showers while singing about names and remembrance. The doorman still doesn't look up when I pass through the lobby, but sometimes, late at night, I catch him reading that same old newspaper, the one with Howard's photograph. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the building's ancient ventilation system, you can hear two voices singing together, a baritone and a tenor slightly out of sync, both insisting that they'll be remembered. They'll remember our names, Howard and I, though perhaps not in the way either of us had planned. The building at 1220 North State Parkway still stands in Chicago's Gold Coast, its limestone trim darkened by decades of city grime, its red bricks faded to the color of old roses. Current residents will tell you that apartments 4A and 4B remain perpetually empty, though they appear on the rental market every few years. The listing photos always show the same furniture: a leather armchair, a mahogany dining table, and a bed with crisp white sheets that smell of lavender and dust. And if you pass by on a quiet winter evening, when the snow muffles the city's usual clamor, you might hear music drifting from the fourth floor. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata played on a piano that doesn't exist, accompanied by two voices singing about names that history has already forgotten. One voice leads, the other follows, eternally out of step, like a dance whose partners can never quite find their rhythm. Story 4. Isabel Wren had long suspected that reality was a thin membrane stretched over something else entirely. Something that writhed and pulsed beneath the surface of what we call normal. Working late that Thursday evening at the Morgan Stanley building on Broadway, she found herself contemplating this idea as she stared at the ever-shifting numbers on her screen, each digit seeming to squirm slightly before settling into its assigned place in the endless columns of data. The fluorescent lights had begun their nightly metamorphosis hours ago, transforming from mere illumination into something that felt almost predatory. Their buzz had taken on the quality of insects boring into her skull, and the sharp edges of her computer screen now dissolved into soft, nauseating halos that made her think of decay captured in amber. It was nearly midnight when she finally gathered her belongings, her bones aching with the unique exhaustion that comes from hunching over spreadsheets for 14 hours straight, trying to make sense of numbers that increasingly seemed like hieroglyphs from some mad civilization. The office had emptied hours ago, leaving her alone in the vast open floor. As she walked between the cubicles, she noticed how the shadows seemed to move independently of any light source, as if they were attempting to arrange themselves into patterns just beyond human comprehension. The cleaning crew had come and gone, leaving behind the artificial scent of lemon that didn't quite mask an underlying sweetness that reminded her of overripe fruit. In the elevator, Isabel caught a glimpse of herself in the mirrored walls. Her reflection appeared slightly off-center from where it should have been, as if the person in the mirror had shifted a few inches to the left when she wasn't looking. She blinked, and the reflection realigned itself, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it had moved of its own accord. The subway platform was nearly deserted, populated only by the usual late-night denizens of New York's underground arteries. A homeless man in a surprisingly clean suit mumbled equations to himself, his fingers tracing invisible numbers in the air. The train, when it arrived, carried that peculiar emptiness that seems to suggest it might never have had passengers at all, might have been traveling these tunnels empty since the beginning of time. She took a seat across from a man in an impeccably pressed charcoal suit who hadn't been there a moment ago. Throughout the journey, she couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't blinked once, that his eyes remained fixed on a point just above her left shoulder. When she shifted position to see what he might be looking at, she found only the darkness of the tunnel beyond the window, punctuated by lights that seemed to flash in sequences that almost made sense. When she emerged from the Borough Hall station in Brooklyn Heights, the autumn air carried an unusual stillness, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton wool or perhaps formaldehyde. The usual urban cacophony had been replaced by a silence that seemed to have physical weight, pressing against her eardrums like deep ocean pressure. Isabel had walked this route hundreds of times since moving to New York 5 years ago, past the row of brownstones on Montague Street, each one slightly different from its neighbors in ways that now seemed calculated rather than organic, past the Thai restaurant that never seemed to have any customers but remained inexplicably open, its windows displaying the same plate of pad Thai that hadn't aged or decayed in all the years she'd been walking past it. The antique shop on the corner had always troubled her, though she'd never quite understood why. It perpetually displayed signs announcing its imminent closure, yet never actually closed. Its windows showed the same curious collection of objects: a Victorian doll with eyes that followed passers-by, a clock whose hands moved counterclockwise, and a mirror that she had never seen anyone look into directly. Tonight, she noticed that the doll's dress seemed to be a different color than it had been that morning, though she couldn't quite recall what color it had been before. It was when she turned right at this corner that the world began its subtle transformation into something else entirely. The street before her was wrong in ways that her mind initially refused to process. It was like looking at an optical illusion that slowly reveals itself to be impossible, like an Escher's staircase that only shows its true nature after prolonged observation. The row houses lining both sides were identical in their architectural precision, each one rising exactly 3 stories, their red brick facades unmarred by the usual urban grime that should have accumulated over decades of exposure to city air. Isabel stood motionless, trying to reconcile the street with her mental map of Brooklyn Heights. She had jogged every street in this neighborhood, had memorized its layout during countless morning runs. This street should not exist, could not exist, yet here it stretched before her like a theorem made manifest in brick and mortar. Each window was adorned with black shutters that seemed to have been measured and placed with atomic precision. The wrought iron railings flanking each stoop curved in identical arcs that hurt her eyes if she tried to follow them too closely. Streetlights cast pools of sickly yellow illumination at intervals that created a perspective of infinite regression, like facing 2 mirrors toward each other. When she turned around to retrace her steps, she found that the antique shop had vanished, replaced by another identical row house. The Thai restaurant was gone as well, as was any trace of Montague Street. There was only this street stretching in both directions with its perfect, maddening symmetry. The silence here had a different quality than the cotton wool stillness of before. This was the silence of a vacuum, of a place where sound itself was an impossibility. Her heels clicked against the immaculate concrete sidewalk, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the street itself were mimicking her footsteps in some bizarre act of mockery. The house numbers began to draw her attention. They defied any logical sequence, jumping from 147 to 3,892 to 17 without pattern or reason. Some contained combinations of digits that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them, forming sequences that suggested meanings just beyond the reach of human comprehension. One particular number made her nose bleed when she tried to read it, the digits arranging themselves into shapes that her mind refused to process. Time became fluid, stretching and contracting like elastic. She walked for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes, might have been days. The street extended before her endlessly, the neat rows of houses multiplying like cancer cells under a microscope. each one a perfect replica of its neighbors, yet somehow suggesting subtle variations that vanished when viewed directly. It was then that she noticed the first inhabitant of this impossible street. A figure stood motionless on one of the stoops, wearing a dress that might have been fashionable in the 1950s. As Isabel drew closer, moving with the slow inevitability of someone in a dream, she realized that the figure's face was smooth and featureless, like an egg made of flesh. Yet somehow she knew with absolute certainty that it was watching her, was aware of her in ways that transcended normal perception. More figures began to emerge, each one appearing silently on the stoops of their identical houses. A man in a business suit that seemed to have been cut according to patterns that weren't quite Euclidean. A child holding a ball in hands that contained too many fingers, arranged in spirals rather than rows. An elderly woman whose outline seemed to blur at the edges, as if she were slowly dissolving into the air around her. None of them had faces, yet all of them watched her. She could feel their attention, like physical pressure against her skin, could sense their anticipation, like static electricity before a storm. Isabel began to run, though she knew somewhere in the deeper recesses of her mind that running was pointless, that the street had already claimed her just as it had claimed all the others. The clicking of her heels became a frenzied percussion, echoing from every direction at once, the sound fragmenting and reassembling itself into patterns that almost formed words in a language she was beginning to understand despite herself. The identical houses blurred past, their windows now illuminated by pale yellow lights that revealed more of the faceless figures, all standing perfectly still, all oriented toward her like flowers tracking the sun. Some wore clothes from different eras, a flapper dress from the 1920s, a leather jacket from the 1980s, a tech company hoodie that might have been worn yesterday. All of them were caught in mid-gesture, as if frozen in the act of welcoming her home. When she finally stopped running, her lungs burning with air that felt too thick to be oxygen, Isabel noticed something in one of the windows that made her mind recoil from its own processes of perception. Her reflection showed a face that was beginning to smooth over, like wax melting in reverse. She reached up to touch her features and found them softening, losing definition, becoming like the faces of all the others who resided in this street that collected the missing. A door creaked open nearby, the sound containing harmonics that suggested geometric principles beyond those taught in any earthly mathematics. In her peripheral vision, she saw one of the figures beckoning to her with a hand that moved all wrong, its joints bending in directions that violated every principle of anatomy she had ever learned. The figure wore a dress she recognized, and the same dress she had worn to her senior prom in 2009, the night she had disappeared for 3 hours and never could recall where she had gone. Understanding came then, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow seepage of knowledge into her consciousness, like water filling a subterranean cavity. This street had always been waiting for her, had always known she would return, just as it waited for all those who had ever gone missing, who had vanished without trace from the ordinary world of numbered streets and imperfect architecture. The figure extended its hand further, fingers spiraling in patterns that she now recognized as a form of writing, spelling out truths that existed beyond the realm of human language. Isabel felt her feet moving of their own accord toward the open door, each step bringing her closer to an understanding of what she had always been meant to become. As she crossed the threshold, she noticed the house number. It was the date of her first disappearance, rendered in digits that pulsed and writhed like living things. Inside, the house was identical to every other house on the street. down to the smallest detail. It was also her childhood home in San Francisco, and her first apartment in Boston, and every place she had ever lived or dreamed of living. The walls seemed to breathe with a subtle rhythm that might have been a heartbeat, or might have been the sound of reality slowly unraveling itself into its component parts. The door closed behind her with the finality of a mathematical proof being completed, and Isabel Wren took her place among the residents of the street that collected the missing. Her face, now as smooth and featureless as all the others, turned toward the window. Through it, she could see a young woman in a business suit walking past, looking confused and afraid. Isabel raised her hand in greeting, her too many fingers moving in patterns that would have been impossible before, spelling out welcomes in geometries that only the missing could comprehend. She had found her way home at last, to the place where all lost things eventually return. In the real world, the headline in the next day's New York Post would read, "Wall Street analyst vanishes in Brooklyn Heights, no traces found." It would join the thousands of similar stories that papered the walls of the identical houses on the endless street, each one a record of another soul claimed by the place where the missing go to live out their geometrically perfect eternities. And somewhere in Brooklyn Heights, an antique shop that never quite goes out of business continues to mark the entrance to a street that appears only to those who are ready to disappear. Its window display features a single item, a mirror that shows viewers their faces as they will appear when all features have been stripped away, when they too join the endless procession of the vanished. The owner of the shop, if you could see their face beneath their hat, hasn't had any features at all for a very, very long time. Sometimes, late at night, they can be seen adjusting the Victorian doll in the window, its dress changing color with each touch, its eyeless gaze fixed on the spot where the impossible street begins. Story 5. We found the door on Beacon Street in Boston, propped against the dumpster behind an antique shop that had recently closed. I remember the day with unsettling clarity. How the October wind carried the first hint of winter. How the maple leaves skidded across the cracked sidewalk like nervous animals. How Richard's eyes lit up in that peculiar way they did when he thought he'd discovered something special. The shop had been there for decades, its windows clouded with age, its interior a maze of forgotten treasures and expensive regrets. I'd often walked past it on my way to the grocery store, glimpsing tantalizing fragments of gilt frames and crystal decanters through the dusty glass. Now it stood empty, its contents scattered to estate sales and auction houses, leaving only this one piece, this door, like a forgotten period at the end of a long sentence. My husband, Richard, insisted we take it home. He had been searching for months for a statement piece for his home office, something to complement the Victorian architecture of our Brookline townhouse. The door was solid oak, weathered to a deep honey color, with intricate carved panels depicting what appeared to be ivy leaves twining around classical columns. The brass doorknob, though tarnished, caught the late afternoon light with surprising brilliance. I watched as Richard ran his fingers over the carvings, tracing the patterns with the same intense concentration he usually reserved for his legal briefs. I should have recognized the warning signs. In my family, we have always had a sense about objects that carry weight. My grandmother, with her strange oils and whispered prayers, would have called it history. But that wasn't quite right. Some things collect more than just years and memories. Some things develop appetites. That first evening, Richard spent hours cleaning the door, lovingly removing decades of grime with Murphy's oil soap and soft cloths. I sat in his office doorway, supposedly working on my novel, but really watching him. He talked as he worked, spinning plans for where to mount it, how to light it, what furniture to pair it with. The more he cleaned, the more detailed the carvings became. Ivy leaves so precise I could see the veins in them. Columns with fluting so deep they seemed to recede into the wood itself. "Look at this craftsmanship," he kept saying. "You don't see work like this anymore. This isn't just a door, it's art." He was right in a way. But art isn't always benign. We mounted it that weekend on the wall of his office, centered between two tall windows that overlooked our small garden. Richard insisted on doing it himself, though the door was remarkably heavy. I held the level while he drilled the mounting brackets into the wall studs, and together we lifted it into place. The solid thunk it made as it settled into the brackets seemed to resonate through the entire house. That night, I dreamed of knocking. In my dream, I walked through our house, past the kitchen with its marble countertops that Richard had insisted on, past the living room where my unfinished novel sat, accusing me for my laptop, past the dining room where we hadn't hosted a dinner party in months because Richard was always working late at the firm. I followed the sound of knocking, but it kept shifting, leading me in circles. Sometimes it seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, a patient, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. I woke at dawn to find Richard already dressed for work, standing in his office doorway. His Brooks Brothers suit looked oddly rumpled, as if he'd slept in it. He was staring at the empty wall where the door had been the night before. "Did you move it?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Some kind of joke?" "We found it in the guest bedroom, perfectly mounted, as if it had always been there, though we had no door frame that could possibly match its dimensions. The brass doorknob gleamed in the morning light, and I could have sworn the ivy carvings had shifted slightly, curling in a different direction. Must have been sleepwalking again," Richard said with forced cheerfulness, adjusting his tie. "Remember last month when I reorganized the entire pantry in my sleep? Same thing." But his hands shook as he poured his coffee, splashing dark drops onto the counter he usually kept immaculate. He left without drinking it, without kissing me goodbye, without his briefcase. I heard his car idle in the driveway for several long minutes before he finally drove away. That was the beginning, though I didn't know it then. I spent that day trying to rationalize what had happened, measuring the door's dimensions, examining the wall where it had originally been mounted. The brackets were still there, bent as if under great force. The screws weren't stripped. They were pristine, as if they'd never been used at all. I called Angela, my grandmother's oldest friend, but didn't leave a message. What would I say? Our antique door is wandering around the house at night? I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself, what that might mean. Each morning after that, the door would be somewhere new. The dining room, the master bathroom, the basement stairs. We began to photograph it each evening before bed, documenting its original position. The photos became increasingly bizarre. The door upside down in the laundry room, horizontally across the kitchen entrance, once impossibly balanced on the narrow windowsill of our third-floor landing. Richard's response was to attack the problem with logic, as he did all problems. He called a locksmith, who found nothing unusual about the door's mechanism, but couldn't explain why the key he made didn't work. Then a carpenter, who declared the door to be at least 200 years old, but couldn't identify the wood species. Finally, an engineer from MIT, who set up sensors and monitors around the house. Her instruments detected unusual temperature fluctuations around the door, but she attributed this to old house drafts and poor insulation. I noticed she didn't want to touch the door herself. The dreams grew more frequent. I began to hear voices behind the door. whispers in languages I didn't understand but somehow knew were ancient. They reminded me of the prayers my grandmother used to murmur over her collection of old objects, things she said needed to be kept quiet. I should have asked her more questions while she was alive. Richard stopped sleeping entirely. I would find him wandering the house at night, pressing his ear against walls, mumbling about finding the right spot. Dark circles formed under his eyes. His perfect posture began to slip. The managing partner at his law firm called me, concerned about the briefs Richard had filed. Apparently, he'd begun inserting paragraphs in unknown languages into routine contracts. We tried locking the door in the basement. Richard bought heavy chains and a padlock from a Home Depot, secured the door to the cement wall, and installed a motion-activated camera. That night, I sat up watching the live feed on my laptop while Richard paced the kitchen above me. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the screen showed nothing but static. When the image cleared 10 seconds later, the door was gone. We found it in the attic that morning, still bound in chains, but now they were rusted, as if they'd spent decades under salt water. The air around it smelled of seaweed and temporal displacement. Richard checked himself into McLean Hospital the next day. His partners were understanding. Apparently, working 60-hour weeks in corporate law leads to breakdowns all the time. They sent flowers. I put them in a vase next to the door, which had returned to his office. By evening, the flowers had aged 3 weeks in 3 hours, dropping dried petals onto Richard's Persian rug. Then came the night I heard real knocking. I was alone in the house. Richard had been at McLean for a week. The door had spent the past several days in our bedroom, directly opposite our bed. I had taken to sleeping on the living room couch, but even there I could feel it, like a weight pressing against my chest. The knock was different from my dreams. 3 sharp raps, then 2 soft ones, then silence. I knew I should ignore it. I knew I should call someone, the police, a priest, Angela with her grandmother-taught wisdom. Instead, I found myself climbing the stairs, drawn by an impossible certainty that this time, this night, the door had finally found its proper place. The bedroom was cold, far colder than October in New England had any right to be. Frost traced delicate patterns on the windows, forming shapes that reminded me of the door's carved ivy. The door stood against the wall where I'd left it, but something was different. The carving seemed to writhe in the moonlight, and the tarnished brass doorknob gleamed as if newly polished. Another knock. This time I could see the wood vibrate with the impact. The sound reminded me of my grandmother's knuckles on my bedroom door when I was small, checking if I was awake, if I was safe, if I was still myself. I approached slowly, her warnings echoing in my head. Never open a door without knowing what's on the other side. Never invite something in unless you're sure you can make it leave. Never trust an object that wants something from you. But as I drew closer, I realized I could see light around the edges of the door. Impossible light, since the door was mounted flush against a solid wall. The light was golden and warm, carrying with it the scent of summer grass and distant spices I couldn't name. It reminded me of the way dust motes had danced in the lights of my grandmother's kitchen, where she taught me about the things that live in the spaces between what we think we know and what we fear to learn. The doorknob was warm under my palm, like a living thing. I know I shouldn't have turned it. I know I shouldn't have pulled the door open. But by then, I understood what it had been trying to do all those nights, moving from room to room, searching. It hadn't been looking for the right place to open. It had been looking for the right person to open it. Perhaps it had recognized something in me, some inheritance from my grandmother, some willingness to see the world as it really is, not as we pretend it to be. Beyond the threshold, I saw a vast hall of pale stone, its ceiling lost in shadow. Pillars rose like ancient trees, wrapped in living ivy that glowed with soft phosphorescence. The air that drifted out was warm and sweet, carrying whispers of languages that had died before Rome was founded. In that moment, I understood why my grandmother had kept so many strange objects in her house, why she had spent so much time teaching me about them. She had been preparing me for this choice. I'd like to say I closed the door. I'd like to say I ran downstairs, called Angela, called anyone, and had the door destroyed. I'd like to say I remembered my grandmother's warnings and chose safety over curiosity. But the truth is, I stepped through. The door closed behind me with a sound like a sigh. I heard it lock, a final, definitive click that should have terrified me, but instead felt like coming home. Later, much later, when they found our house empty, they would discover the door had vanished completely, leaving only a faint impression in the wall's plaster, like a half-remembered dream. Richard eventually returned home from McLean, but the house felt wrong to him now, too empty, too quiet, too normal. He sold it at a loss and moved to Seattle, where he never again bought antique furniture and developed an intense fear of wooden doors. Sometimes he dreams of me, he told his new therapist, but in the dreams I'm walking through endless halls of stone and starlight, my footsteps echoing in perfect time with distant music that sounds like his name spoken in a language too old for human tongues. He's not wrong. The door appears sometimes in other places. A Boston University professor spotted it in the basement of the Stone Science Building. A janitor at the Boston Public Library swears he saw it in the rare book room after hours. A homeless man claims it stood for 3 nights in the corner of Park Street Station, whispering promises to passers-by. But it never stays long. It's not looking for a home anymore. It found what it wanted that night in October. Someone who would understand its purpose. Someone who would open it without fear. Someone who would choose wonder over safety. I should have known better. In my family, we have always had a sense about such things. But sometimes, the hunger for something more, something other, runs deeper than caution or wisdom or family warnings. Sometimes, a door isn't just a door, and what waits behind it isn't emptiness, but possibility. If you're ever walking in Boston at twilight and see an old oak door with ivy-carved panels leaning against the wall, walk away. Don't look at how the brass doorknob catches the light. Don't listen for the whispers that drift from beneath it. Don't imagine what might lie behind it. But if you do, if you can't help yourself, if the hunger in you recognizes the hunger in it, at least know what choice you're making. The door isn't lost anymore. It's just looking for others like me who are willing to leave the safety of known walls for the wild beauty of whatever waits beyond the threshold. I hear the knocking sometimes, even now, echoing through these endless halls. But I'm not the one it's calling to anymore. I'm already where I chose to be, where I perhaps was always meant to be. The door has other work to do, other seekers to find. And somewhere in Boston, right now, it's waiting. Story 6. The thing about working with old books is that after a while, they start to feel like living creatures. Each one has its own personality, its own particular scent and texture. Some are gentle, fragile things that need to be coaxed open like shy animals. Others are robust and demanding, commanding attention with their brass clasps and heavyweight bindings. But in 22 years as associate curator of rare books at the Boston Athenaeum, I had never met one quite like the Ledger. You know the Athenaeum, right? That imposing brownstone on Beacon Street? just a stone's throw from the State House. The kind of place where even the dust feels educated, where membership costs more than a month's rent in Somerville, and the regulars treat their library cards like American Express Black. I used to love that about it, the exclusivity, the quiet importance of it all. Funny how meaningless that seems now. My name's David Aldrich, and I guess you could say I'm writing this as a confession. Or maybe a warning, though I doubt it'll do any good. Warnings never do, not really. Not when you're dealing with something like the Ledger. It started on December 13th, one of those bitter Boston winter days when the wind comes screaming off the common like it's got a personal grudge against anything with a pulse. The kind of cold that makes you question why anyone ever settled in New England in the first place. I was down in the basement stacks, doing our annual inventory check, a mind-numbing but necessary evil in the rare books world. The basement of the Athenaeum isn't like the upper floors with their soaring ceilings and carefully curated reading rooms. Down there, it's all fluorescent lights and metal shelving, the air heavy with that particular mix of dust and preservation chemicals that all old libraries share. The ventilation system wheezed overhead, making the same sounds it had probably made since the Johnson administration. I was in section 918.3, checking our holdings against the shelf list. It's the kind of work that becomes almost meditative after a few hours. Verify the call number, check the condition, mark it off on the inventory sheet, move to the next one. The rhythm of it must have been why I almost missed it at first. It was wedged between a water-damaged copy of Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana and some forgotten Victorian travelogue about expeditions to the Yukon. Black leather binding, the kind that feels almost organic under your fingers, like it might be warm to the touch. The gold lettering had mostly flaked away, leaving only LED and 1,876 inches visible on the spine. Now, I should explain something here. In a place like the Athenaeum, finding an uncatalogued book isn't exactly common, but it's not unheard of either. We got over 500,000 volumes, some dating back to the colonial era. Things get missed, misplaced, forgotten. Standard procedure is to fill out a form, notify collections management, and let them handle it. But this book, there was something about it that made my hands itch. You spend enough time around old books, you develop a sense about them. Like how some people can feel storm coming in their bones. This one had presence, weight, like it had been waiting. I remember checking my watch, 3:47 p.m. Funny how your mind catalogs these little details when your life is about to change. The fluorescent light above me was flickering, creating this strobe effect that made the shadows dance on the shelves. The heating system had kicked in, making the pipes in the walls knock and groan like restless spirits. I should have followed procedure. Should have filled out the form, handed it over to collections. Instead, I took it to my office upstairs. Told myself I'd just take a quick look, document any obvious provenance marks before submitting it for proper cataloging. My office was on the 3rd floor, overlooking Beacon Street. It was barely bigger than a closet, but it had a window, which made it prime real estate by library standards. The late afternoon light was already fading. Winter in Boston means darkness starts creeping in around 4 p.m., like the night's getting an early start on swallowing the day. I cleared a space on my desk, pushing aside the usual debris of academic life. Departmental memos, conservation reports, half-empty coffee cups that had long gone cold. The book seemed to absorb the light around it, the black leather drinking in what little illumination remained in the day. When I opened it, the binding made a sound like a sigh. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, thousands of them, in a precise hand that somehow managed to be both elegant and utterly devoid of personality. Each entry followed the same format. Name, birth date, and location, followed by significant life events, and finally, a death date with cause. At first glance, it looked like a genealogical record, the kind of thing amateur historians compile while tracing their family trees. But as I started reading, I noticed something odd. The entries weren't chronological. They jumped around through time like a drunk stumbling through decades. The first entry I read in detail was for someone named Herbert Walsh, born 1962 in Quincy. Nothing remarkable about that until I got to his death date, December 24th, 2024. Cause of death: choking incident at family Christmas dinner, turkey bone. I remember laughing when I read that. It seemed absurd, like something out of a bad horror movie. I flipped through more pages. Some entries dated back to colonial times, others extended into what was clearly the future. Deaths by consumption and smallpox shared space with predictions of heart attacks and cancer yet to come, all centered around Boston and New England, all recorded in that same meticulous hand. The sun had fully set by then, leaving my office in the gray twilight that comes before true darkness. I should have turned on the lights, but something kept me from moving. Maybe some part of me knew what about to find and wanted to delay it as long as possible. I had just decided to call it a day when I saw it. My own name, written in that same eerily precise handwriting. David Matthew Aldrich, B. April 15th, 1975, Newton Wellesley Hospital, Newton, Massachusetts. Everything was there. My childhood in Newton, right down to the address on Commonwealth Avenue where I grew up. My parents' divorce when I was 12. The custody arrangement. The weekends with Dad in his sad little apartment in Watertown. The summer I broke my arm falling off the jungle gym at Cold Spring Park. My marriage to Andrea in 2003 at the Church of the Covenant in Back Bay. Our divorce in 2011, after years of trying and failing to have children. My hands were shaking by then, but I couldn't stop reading. The entries continued into the future. March 12, 2025, diagnosed with aggressive glioblastoma at Mass General Hospital. March 15, 2025, begins experimental treatment protocol. June 28, 2025, treatment declared unsuccessful. August 15, 2025, death, Covenant House Hospice, Brighton. I sat there in the dark, staring at those words until they burned themselves into my brain. Outside my window, the lights of Beacon Street blurred and swam. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance, probably an ambulance headed to Mass General. The same hospital where, according to the ledger, I would receive my death sentence in just a few months. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of it. This had to be some elaborate prank, right? But who would know all those details about my life? Who would go to the trouble of creating this massive volume, filling it with thousands of entries, just to mess with one middle-aged librarian? I did what any modern person would do. I started Googling names from the book. The historical entries checked out perfectly against church records, newspaper archives, and genealogical databases. Herbert Walsh was real, living in a split-level ranch in Quincy with his wife and 3 kids. I found his Facebook page, filled with photos of family gatherings and proud grandparent moments. I wondered if I should warn him about the turkey. That's when I made my first mistake. I decided to take the book home. The Athenaeum has strict policies about removing items from the collection, but I had override privileges as associate curator. I checked it out to myself, listing it as a recent acquisition requiring evaluation. My hands were sweating as I signed the form, like the book's darkness might somehow seep through the paper and stain the records themselves. My apartment in Somerville is a second-floor walk-up in one of those triple-deckers that define working-class New England. It's nothing fancy, but it's home. That night, though, it felt different. smaller, like the walls had crept in while I was at work. I settled into my reading chair, a battered leather recliner that had been Andrea's parting shot in our divorce settlement, and opened the ledger again. The entries seemed to shift and change in the lamplight, the ink looking fresher on some pages than others, as if they were being continually rewritten by an invisible hand. I read every single entry, twice. Names and dates and deaths began to blur together, creating a tapestry of tragedy stretching across centuries. Some deaths were mundane, heart attacks during morning commutes on the Red Line, strokes in checkout lines at Market Basket, cancer in hospital rooms with views of the Prudential Center. Others were the kind that make the local news. Car crashes on the Mass Pike, workplace accidents at construction sites in the seaport, murders-suicides in quiet suburbs where the neighbors always say they seem like such a nice family. That's when I got what I thought was a brilliant idea. If the book could predict the future, maybe it could be changed. I took out my Mont Blanc fountain pen, a divorce gift to myself, because sometimes retail therapy is the best therapy, and carefully crossed out the entry about my brain cancer. Then, with what felt like tremendous authority, I wrote in a new cause of death. Natural causes, age 92, surrounded by loving family. The ink seemed to sink into the page like it was being absorbed by living tissue. For a moment, I felt triumphant. I'd beaten the system, rewritten my own fate. I went to bed that night feeling better than I had in years. The headache started around 3 a.m. Not a normal headache, but the kind that feels like someone's trying to perform amateur surgery on your brain with a rusty spoon. I stumbled to the bathroom, fumbled for the light switch, and nearly threw up from the sudden brightness. When I checked the ledger again, my entry had reverted to its original form. The ink from my changes was gone like it had never existed. But there was something new, a newspaper clipping stuck between the pages. The paper crisp and fresh like it had just come off the press. It was dated August 16, 2025, from the Boston Globe. Local librarian David Aldrich, 50, passed away yesterday at Covenant House Hospice after a 5-month battle with brain cancer. In March, Aldrich had attracted media attention after surviving a near-fatal car accident on Storrow Drive that left him with severe head trauma, leading to the discovery of his terminal condition. The message was clear. Try to avoid one fate, and the universe would find another path to the same destination. The book hadn't just rejected my change, it had shown me how its prophecy would come true. But I've never been good at taking hints. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything. Different pens, different inks. I tried tearing out pages. They grew back overnight, the paper regenerating like healing flesh. I took a box cutter to my entire entry one night after too much scotch. The cuts sealed themselves like wounds, healing and fast forward. Each time, new newspaper clippings would appear, showing how my attempts to change fate only served to fulfill it. That's when things got worse. The changes started affecting other people. The first was Andrea. I hadn't spoken to her since the divorce, but her name appeared in the book the day after I tried burning my entry. Andrea Lynn Cavanaugh, née Peters, B. June 3rd, 1977, Beth Israel Hospital, Boston, Massachusetts. Death, August 15, 2025. Suicide by prescription overdose following ex-husband's death. The book was like a virus, spreading through the lives of everyone connected to me. The more I fought it, the more collateral damage I caused. My sister in Brookline, my best friend in Cambridge, even my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rossi, their entries started appearing, their fates intertwining with mine in increasingly horrific ways. Last week, I made my final attempt. I took the book down to the incinerator room in my building's basement. The maintenance guy, Eddie, gives me weird looks now, probably because I spent 20 minutes watching the book burn, making sure every page was reduced to ash. It didn't matter. The next morning, it was sitting on my desk at the Athenaeum. Brand new binding, pristine pages, that same incomplete title in gold lettering. But now my entry had an update. February 5th, 2025. Attempted destruction of the ledger, unsuccessful. March 12th, 2025. Diagnosed with aggressive glioblastoma. The dates haven't changed. Just 6 more weeks until the headaches start. 5 months until whatever force drives this thing collects its due. I've stopped trying to fight it. Instead, I'm writing this down, hoping someone finds it. Not as a warning. Warnings don't work against something like this, but as a record. The book keeps track of our deaths. Someone should keep track of how we lived. I've started putting my affairs in order. Donated most of my books to the Athenaeum, except for the ledger that stays locked in my desk drawer. Made peace with Andrea. Started spending more time with my sister and her kids. If you can't change the ending, might as well make the story worth reading, right? But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake listening to the radiator clank and whistle in my apartment, I wonder, what if the book isn't predicting our deaths at all? What if it's causing them? What if every time someone finds it and reads their entry, they set in motion the very events that will lead to their demise? Like Schrodinger's cat in reverse, the observation doesn't determine the outcome. The outcome reaches back through time to ensure the observation. Or maybe I'm just trying to make sense of something that defies explanation. Maybe that's what we all do when faced with the certainty of our own ending. Try to wrap it up in metaphors and meanings until it feels less like an ending and more like a story. I've got the book right here as I write this. The leather feels warmer now, almost like skin. Sometimes I swear I can feel it pulse like a heart beating inside that binding. The pages turn themselves, always opening to my entry. The ink looks fresher every day, darker, like it's being constantly rewritten by an invisible hand. You probably think I'm crazy. That's okay. I probably am. But if you're ever at the Boston Athenaeum, up in the rare books collection, and you see a black leather volume with faded gold lettering, well, I guess that's between you and whatever keeps the ledger. Just remember, some stories are better left unread. And if you happen to be there on August 15th, raise a glass for old David Aldrich. I may not know much anymore, but I know this. Whatever happens that day, it'll make one hell of an entry. Found among the personal effects of David M. Aldrich, former associate curator of rare books at the Boston Athenaeum, following his death from complications of glioblastoma on August 15th, 2025. The black leather book mentioned in this account was never located. However, several members of the library staff have reported finding similar volumes in the basement stacks, though none have remained in the collection long enough for proper cataloging. Story 7. The old Mansibashi Station in Tokyo holds many secrets. Built in 1912, it stands as a relic of the Meiji era, its red brick facade weathered by time and tragedy. The station's dark mysteries have a way of seeping into one's consciousness, like water through ancient stone, slowly but inexorably drawing you deeper until escape becomes impossible. I never intended to discover its darkest story, the tale of the ghost bride of Mansibashi, but fate, I've learned, is not interested in our intentions. My name is Clara Winters, and I am a British architectural photographer. I came to Tokyo in November 2023 to document historical railway stations for a coffee table book. The project seemed straightforward enough when my publisher first proposed it. Capture the grandeur of Japan's railway heritage, write the accompanying text, and returned to London before Christmas. Simple, clean, professional. I had done similar projects before, stations in India, colonial-era terminals in Hong Kong, the grand old railways of Europe. This should have been no different. Tokyo welcomed me with its peculiar blend of ancient and ultra-modern, a city where glass skyscrapers cast shadows over centuries-old temples. My first week was spent photographing the busy hubs, Tokyo Station, with its restored Marunouchi facade, the perpetual organized chaos of Shibuya, the multi-layered complexities of Shinjuku. But it was the smaller stations that truly called to me, the ones tucked away in quieter corners of the city, where history still clings to weathered walls and empty platforms. That's how I first heard about Mansebashi. I was reviewing my shots in a small coffee shop near Ochanomizu Station when I overheard two elderly men discussing it. They spoke in low voices, but one word caught my attention. Yurai, ghost. I had learned enough Japanese to recognize that much. When I turned to ask them about it, they fell silent, exchanging glances that made my skin prickle. Sumimasen, I said, bowing slightly. I couldn't help overhearing. I'm photographing old stations for a book. Could you tell me about Mansebashi? The younger of the two men shook his head and made his excuses, leaving quickly. But the other, who introduced himself as Mr. Tanaka, remained, studying me with eyes that had seen too much. After a long moment, he gestured to the empty seat at his table. "You are interested in old stations?" he asked in careful English. When I nodded, he continued, "I was a station master there many years ago, before they closed the platforms, before they built the shopping center." He paused, testing the weight of his next words. "Why do you want to know about Mansebashi?" I explained my project, showing him some of my photographs on my laptop. He examined them with professional interest, nodding at my composition choices, commenting on the historical details I'd captured. But when I mentioned wanting to photograph Mansebashi, his weathered hands began to tremble. "You shouldn't go there after dark," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The afternoon light seemed to dim around us, as if the mere mention of the station had drawn shadows closer. Some places remember too much." I waited, knowing from experience that silence often draws out the stories people are afraid to tell. Mr. Tanaka stared into his cooling green tea, lost in memories he'd rather forget. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, become distant, as if he were reading from some ancient text. "In 1925, there was a wedding party," he began. "The bride, Akiko Yamamoto, was traveling to meet her groom. It was arranged, as many marriages were in those days, but they had met several times, and there was genuine affection between them. She wore a traditional shiromuku, white as fresh snow, and carried plum blossoms. Her family had gathered at the station to see her off. The train was to take her to Yokohama, where her groom and his family waited." He fell silent again, fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on his glass. Outside, the early winter darkness was settling over Tokyo, streetlights flickering to life one by one. "The train never arrived," he continued finally. "They found her body 3 days later in the tunnel, still wearing her wedding kimono. They said she had jumped, but..." He shook his head. "The tunnel workers, they reported seeing her that same night, standing on the platform. Waiting, they said. Always waiting, and sometimes..." "Sometimes what?" I asked, leaning forward. "Sometimes she still waits." He met my eyes then, and the fear I saw there made my breath catch. "Every station has its stories, Miss Winters. Ghost stories, tragic stories. Most are just that, stories. But Mansebashi," he shuddered, "there have been disappearances over the years. People who visit the old platforms after dark. They go in, but they don't come out. The police investigate, but they never find anything. Just empty platforms and cold air that smells of plum blossoms. I should have heeded his warning. Any sensible person would have focused on the active stations, the safe ones, brightly lit and full of people. But I had built my career on capturing the forgotten places, the abandoned and the overlooked. And something about Mr. Tanaka's story called to me, like a voice, just below the threshold of hearing. The next morning, I began researching Manseibashi Station's history. The facts were easy enough to find, built during the Meiji period, designed by architect Kingo Tatsuno, who had also designed Tokyo Station. The red brick building was a masterpiece of fusion architecture, blending Victorian influences with traditional Japanese elements. It had served as a major terminal until the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 damaged parts of the structure. Though repairs were made, the station never fully recovered its former glory. It was finally closed to regular traffic in 1943, during the depths of World War II. But beneath these official facts ran darker currents. I found obscure blog posts in Japanese describing strange encounters in the abandoned sections of the station, photos that showed mysterious orbs of light, strange shadows where shadows shouldn't be, and always mentions of a woman in white, standing on platform 3 long after the last trains had stopped running. It took me 3 days to obtain permission to photograph the abandoned sections of the station. The current building management was reluctant, citing safety concerns, but my credentials and a letter from my publisher finally convinced them. They gave me access for one afternoon, from noon until the sunset. "You must leave before dark," the manager insisted, handing me the keys. "No exceptions." The station's original entrance hall had been converted into a trendy shopping complex, all gleaming tiles and modern lighting. But beyond a locked door at the back, the old station waited, unchanged by time or renovation. As I stepped through that door, it felt like crossing a threshold into another era. The first thing that struck me was the silence, not the absence of sound. There were plenty of sounds. The settling of old wood, the distant rumble of trains on other lines, the whisper of wind through the cracks in the windows. But these sounds seemed to die in the air, as if the space itself swallowed them before they could properly echo. The architecture was everything I'd hoped for. Massive iron beams stretched overhead, their rivets like dark eyes watching my progress. Afternoon sunlight filtered through Victorian-style windows, casting complex shadows across walls that still bore their original tiles, though many were cracked or missing. The platforms stretched away into darkness, their edges worn smooth by decades of long vanished footsteps. I set up my equipment methodically, trying to ignore the growing feeling of being watched. The light was perfect for photography, that rich, golden, late autumn sunlight that makes everything it touches look simultaneously more real and more dreamlike. I started with wide shots of the platforms, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the geometric patterns of the iron framework against the sky. Time behaved strangely in that place. Minutes seemed to stretch like warm toffee, then suddenly snap forward, leaving me disoriented. I would spend what felt like a few minutes composing a shot, only to check my watch and find that an hour had passed. The sunlight moved too quickly, shadows lengthening at an impossible rate. It was during one of these time slips that I first noticed the cold. It crept up gradually, like an incoming tide. One moment I was comfortable in my light jacket. The next I was shivering, my breath fogging in air that shouldn't have been nearly cold enough for that. And with the cold came a scent, subtle at first, then increasingly pervasive. White plum blossoms, the traditional flower of Japanese brides. I had made my way to Platform 3 by then, where Akiko had last been seen alive. The platform was eerily well preserved, its wooden benches still solid despite their age. As I set up my tripod for another shot, I noticed something odd about the quality of light. The sun was setting, but the shadows weren't falling the way they should. They seemed to move independently of the light source, like dancers in a macabre ballet. The first truly inexplicable thing happened as I was checking my camera settings. A white petal drifted down and landed on my viewfinder. I brushed it away absently, then froze as realization hit me. There were no plum trees anywhere near the station. When I looked up, more petals were falling, appearing from nowhere and fading away before they hit the ground. That's when I heard it. The distant rumble of an approaching train. The sound was wrong in every possible way. Too hollow, too deep. As if it were coming from the bottom of a well rather than along the tracks. The rails themselves were rusted, some missing entirely. No train could possibly run on them. Yet the sound grew louder, accompanied by a high-pitched whistle that seemed to pierce my very bones. My hands trembled as I began packing my equipment. The temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on the metal parts of my tripod. The scent of plum blossoms had become overwhelming, cloying, funeral sweet. As I reached for my camera, movement at the far end of the platform caught my eye. She stood perfectly still, a figure in flowing white. Her shiramuku caught non-existent wind, rippling like waves in moonlight that hadn't yet risen. Her back was turned to me, but I could see her hands, pale as bone, clutching a bouquet of withered plum blossoms. Each flower was black with age, yet perfectly preserved, like flowers pressed between the pages of a book for a century. It's just a reflection, I whispered to myself. A trick of light on the old windows. But even as I spoke, she began to turn. Her face was beautiful, in the way that porcelain dolls are beautiful, perfect, and lifeless. Her skin was white as her kimono, her lips painted in a crimson so dark it looked black in the fading light. But it was her eyes that held me, trapped me, drew me in against my will. They were black holes, endless pits that seemed to pull at my soul. When she smiled, I saw the darkness of the tunnel behind her teeth. "Will you attend my wedding?" Her voice was like wind through dead leaves, like silk tearing, like the last breath of the dying. "The guests are waiting. They're all waiting." I ran. My footsteps thundered across the platform, but they couldn't drown out the sound of her gentle laughter or the approaching train. The exit door that had been unlocked all afternoon was now sealed shut, its metal handle freezing against my desperate hands. I pulled until my shoulders ached, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I felt her hand on my shoulder. It was cold, so cold it burned through my jacket and into my flesh. "The train is here," she whispered, her breath like winter wind against my neck. "Our train is finally here." I turned, though every instinct screamed not to. The platform was filled with figures now, transparent shapes, in antiquated clothes, all facing the track. They stood perfectly still, like a photograph from 100 years ago come to life. And there, emerging from the tunnel, was a train that had no business existing. Its black iron body gleamed with an otherworldly sheen, windows glowing with a pale corpse light. It moved silently now, gliding to a stop with the grace of a funeral procession. The doors opened with a sigh like a dying breath. The bride's grip on my shoulder tightened. "Come," she said. "You'll sit with me. All my guests sit with me. Forever." I saw them then in the windows of the train, faces pressed against the glass. Hundreds of faces, their eyes wide with eternal terror. Mouths open in silent screams. I recognized some from old photographs I'd studied. passengers who had vanished from Mansebashi Station over the decades, all of them now trapped in Akiko's eternal wedding journey. What happened next exists in my memory like a series of photographs, snapshots of horror. My desperate struggle as she pulled me toward the train, the impossible strength in her delicate hands, the sensation of my feet leaving the ground, the cold so deep it had felt like my blood was turning to ice. But I had one advantage she didn't expect, my camera's flash. In my panic, I had clutched my camera to my chest. As she dragged me through the train's door, I turned and pressed the shutter. The flash exploded in her face, that terrible, beautiful face, and for just a moment, her grip loosened. I tore free and ran. Ran like I've never run before. Behind me, the bride's scream of rage transformed into the wail of a phantom train whistle. The sound followed me through the station's corridors, up the stairs, and out into the blessed noise and light of modern Tokyo. I didn't stop running until I reached my hotel. That night, I sat in my brightly lit room, jumping at every sound, the smell of plum blossoms still clinging to my clothes. Around 3 a.m, I forced myself to review the photos on my camera. Most were what you'd expect: empty platforms, architectural details, play of light and shadow. But the last image showed Platform 3 crowded with transparent figures in ancient clothes, all facing a train that shouldn't exist. And in the foreground, crystal clear, was a bride in a white shiramuku. Her face turned toward the camera, her black eyes seeming to stare directly into the lens. The photo's metadata reads 0 o'clock, though I know I left the station before midnight. I'm writing this now from London, safely away from Mansebashi Station. My book on Japanese railway architecture will not include that last photograph, though it haunts my dreams. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear a distant train whistle and smell white plum blossoms. And sometimes, just sometimes, I see faces in the windows of passing trains, pale faces with wide, terrified eyes, led by a bride in white, who is still waiting, always waiting, for more guests at her eternal wedding. Mr. Tanaka sent me an email last week. There have been 3 disappearances from Mansebashi Station since my visit. The police found no evidence, no signs of struggle. Just 3 more empty seats on Akiko's ghost train. 3 more faces pressed against those phantom windows. If you ever find yourself in Tokyo, stay away from Mansebashi Station after dark. And if you hear a train whistle late at night and smell white plum blossoms on the air, run. Run as fast as you can. The ghost bride of Mansebashi is always looking for new guests at her wedding, and her celebration never ends.